Hello and welcome to the brand new episode of the Totally Indian Football Show. I'm your host Siju, and yet again I am back with an interesting person on my show because he is from the field of sports law. His expertise is on sports, media, technology, and broadcast. So I'm sure. So stay till the end and enjoy this episode. And Srinivasan, thank you so much for joining and taking time. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Siju, and it's always a pleasure to be on a project that's related to Indian football. And you guys have been doing a very good job. And like you said, the new year has seen a lot of content as well, something that we've all been following. And I'm happy to be a part of it here.
Great. I mean, I think it really is an overwhelming experience when we get people on the show and they really say that they've been hearing and watching or following what we do, and that's really motivates us. So thank you so much for that. And let's kickstart with this. If you can tell our listeners, I think the most interesting one would be how did you pursue this journey into probably becoming the law and the rules and regulation side of things for sport.
Yes, so I graduated from law school in 2012, and back then in Jodhpur, we didn't have too many options. You either went into litigation, dispute resolution, or you got into corporate law. I mean, join a big law firm or any other law firm at that point of time. So I started off with a large law firm in Bombay called Khetan and Co. And I was with them for almost 2.5 years, which is when during the 2015 Cricket World Cup, actually, a very good opportunity at Star came up. And it was too good to pass on. And I mean, having been someone who's followed multiple sports since childhood and having played a decent amount of football during law school as well, this was an opportunity that I wanted to take on because it was essentially being a lawyer in your field of passion, that would be sports. And so that's essentially where my journey in sports law as such started during in Feb 2015, actually 8 years back at Star Sports. And at Star, I think I was fortunate to be a part of a very, very good team which was doing dynamic work. And I managed to work on various properties, including the Premier League, the ISL, the PKL, and of course the international tournaments which were being broadcast on Star. And it was with the end of the Rio Olympics that my stint at Star ended, and I went on to do the FIFA Masters at that point of time. And yeah, after the Masters, I've been back in India, and I have been working in the sports industry here since then. So that's essentially how I ended up being on the sports legal side in India.
Yeah, and I think as you mentioned, you started off with a broadcast, right? So that comes under the media and broadcast section that you've done. So if you can share some of your experience or the things that you probably have to know, I'm sure the listeners would love to know about some anecdote or something that pertaining to, because we watch a lot of games, but then the whole side of, okay, why and how does the channel pick something up and how do they get the rights of, broadcasting so and so tournaments and what goes behind the scenes, if not too much, but if there's something little that you can share, that would be a great one.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's usually far out of the remit of a lawyer in a sports broadcasting organization, a pure business call. But I think, I mean, it's of course no secret that properties where there can be very good commercial returns always, I mean, always attract more suitors. Like, I mean, IPL is a classic case, for example. But again, at Star, for instance, is the time I was at Star was around the time the Kabaddi League started as well, and that was some sort of a revolution in domestic sports, if I could call it, because you're picking up a largely Indian sport and modifying the rules to a certain extent and displaying it in the best possible manner so that it's going to attract a large amount of viewers. And today, I mean, outside of cricket, the PKL is probably one of the most successful commercial properties in Indian sport itself. So that's an example of where a sport might not have made a large amount of commercial sense. I might be wrong because I have no idea about how the commercial evaluation was done, but to a layman at that point of time, how a sport which doesn't have a large amount of commercial potential could still be picked up by a broadcaster and made into a successful property that it is today. So I guess there are multiple channels of thought that go into picking up a particular property or not. And yeah, it's of course a fascinating world out there when you're working behind the scenes and watching it unfold live on TVs on the floor again.
Yeah, I think let's come to talk about now Indian football. That's also the name of our show, and that's probably the listeners would want to know. How has your journey been dealing with? Have you dealt with clubs? Have you dealt with players with regards to certain kind of, or how does your role kind of signify, what you've done and or what you are doing with regards to players and clubs and officials and different stakeholders within the Indian football ecosystem?
Yes. So, I mean, my Indian football journey itself started off while working with AIFF on the baby leagues. And I think post baby leagues, when I launched my own practice along with a couple of friends and my wife called Off the Bench. And this is where we worked a lot on Indian football. I mean, I was fortunate that we ended up working with clubs, with players, agents, and people on the commercial side as well. In fact, one of the first projects that we took up was a potential investment into a club. Now, that deal didn't go through, but it was still a very good learning experience in the sense that the first project that the new firm started off with basically brushed us up completely with what the structuring is and how things work on the legal side in the Indian football industry. And from there on, I think it was an amazing experience. I worked with Orissa FC. I still work with them. And I also continue working with Punjab FC since the Round Glass takeover. So these are clients and relationships that have been built over time as well. And I mean, it's really good to see both the clubs doing well as well in this season. And yeah, I think I've been fortunate in that regard in terms of my journey in Indian football.
Now, when you started off like with your Indian football stint, what was something that probably either did it after knowing of how things have been done and when you came into the picture, how are things like with regards to the contracts or to whatever the commercial side of things, or how were the situation like, because we still call Indian football as something still growing, and it has a long way to go with regards to business and the law side of things. So how would you probably, if you had to share an experience of, did it shock you, surprise you, or were things fine?
I mean, surprised for sure. Things were not fine again for sure because like I mentioned, when I started off in 2019, I was in Delhi and we did this whole round of meeting people and pitching to people for work. And it's probably something that most people who've been in the sports industry for a while would affirm as well. When we say that we are sports lawyers, the immediate reaction was like, take a step back. And one of the most common responses that we received at that point of time was in fact like, I don't need to go to court, so why do I need a lawyer now? Like, our first challenge was in convincing prospective clients that listen, you need a lawyer to ensure that you don't go to court as well. And like you rightly mentioned, the business of football is evolving or has, I mean, taken steps in the last few years. And to make people understand that there needs to be a certain structure was probably our first hurdle, and that was the surprise that I was referring to. But I mean, having said that, the last few years have seen a huge change in the way businesses approach, say, contracts or even disputes at that I mean, talking about that, the way they have approached the legal side of things, which I am more attuned to, is way different than say 4 or 5 years back.
Right, you mentioned about contracts, and that's something I think I'm going to come to next. But before that, if I had to understand now, I would be probably not too educated or informated about these things. So apologies to listeners and to you as well if it's a stupid question. How much of probably the licensing that the clubs have to undergo come under your radar?
So yeah, the licensing process is divided into multiple buckets, and there is a legal bucket which includes like ensuring your contracts are in, you have contracts and with say players, coaches, stadiums, and that there are no dues, etc., and also drafting of internal policies, etc. So we do advise clubs on the club licensing process, but of course it's driven by the clubs themselves largely. And I mean, again, since the nature of the documents don't change to a vast extent, again, it's more of a review after you've done the heavy lifting in the first instance. So yeah, I mean, we're involved, but on a very like, I mean, on a very supervisory basis.
Right. Now let's come to the I think the interesting part of things where we talk about player contracts. And I would also like to add to that the contracts that the coaches sign and everything. So before we get into the nitty-gritties, how important it is for individuals that are there involved in Indian football, with whether it's players, whether it's coaches, whether it's other different stakeholders, to have a basic understanding of their rules and the rights and the laws that they would be probably involved with.
So I think it's a basic principle that any person, I mean, irrespective of the sports industry, we should be aware of what are the rights and obligations that we have under law. And especially when we enter into a contract, I think it's all the more important because you're specifically binding yourself to a set of rights, duties, and obligations, etc. And we need to be aware of what we are signing up in this particular case, and so that, I mean, it's not just fulfilling our obligations but also knowing what we stand to gain from that particular contract. And I think a very good anecdote here would probably be, I think you were also with the AIFC then when we did a masterclass for the coaches on contracts for coaches, professional contracts. And I think it was a very good session in the sense that we could get the message across that these are the basic elements of a contract that you need to look into. And considering the questions that we got from the coaches who were in attendance as well, there is a, I mean, the sense that we got is there is a clear audience. I mean, the coaches are there and they're eager to know what their rights and obligations, etc., are. But the disconnects essentially, basically, there is no one to convey this message across. So I think a session like what we done with AIFC helps a lot in sending the message across to the coaches, for instance, in that particular case, in understanding what their basic rights and obligations are when they get into a contract.
Right, yes, very well remember that. And as much as you mentioned, like it's a basic thing, now my question is, having interacted with so many players and coaches in the past or different folks in Indian football, now does that surprise you of the knowledge that players or coaches possess about these? Because that is something like, as someone been following, worked as a journalist and now in behind the scenes with the media front of things, I always doubt if players and coaches really know what they are signing onto that piece of paper and what is written, and if they understand those clauses and contracts. What do you have to say about that?
So I mean, I have seen cases where probably the only thing that was looked at was the numbers. So the minute the numbers are fine, players used to go and sign the contract saying, Acha, I'm getting the money, so I'm all right with this. But there are multiple things that go behind when those money actually reaches your account, and what are the duties and obligations on both parties, etc., which usually it's essentially a game of bargaining power, right? So the party with a better bargaining power in a transaction obviously takes a position of advantage in that particular scenario. But that said, I think with a lot more agents coming into play, things have improved, I should say, in the sense that there's a lot more knowledge that's being passed on to the players and the interests of the players being protected. And on the other hand, I think players are also picking things up as to like, these are things that I need to watch out for in a contract. I mean, yes, X is the amount that I'm getting paid, but I need to know when I'm getting paid and when do I have the right to, for instance, send them a notice or go to the player status committee to press my claim and get the money that's legally due to me. Now, of course, there are other aspects that come into play which might restrict a player from approaching taking legal action itself, but at least, I mean, it's more often than not that you see these days where the player knows that these are his rights in terms of a particular contract.
Right. Now, the fact that how important now we have so many academies and so many clubs, more so where academies pull students to that. I work for one where we say that it's a holistic development and we give you education or the football side of things. How important do you think is that in the curriculum of Indian football, or when they are getting out? Yes, education is important, but how much of importance should also be education of these kind of things, like you mentioned, the workshop that was done, or the masterclass that was done for the coaches? It's still something new, and it's something, it can't be a one off thing, right? You also mentioned how they don't have an access to people who probably would convey it to them on a daily basis or whenever they are in need. So, how important becomes then a responsibility for these clubs and academies to inculcate that bit and educate their players and coaches that they have in their system about these aspects as well? Because I think we are too engrossed in getting the goals scored, in getting the football philosophy side of things. But I think basic things like these then take a back seat.
Yeah, I mean, there are things that take the headline, and there are things that are usually typed in small print. And I think the small prints as important as the ones that take the headline. And what you just spoke about is essentially that. And if we're talking about building an ecosystem, it's about building equal stakeholders. I mean, stakeholders who have equal strength and equal knowledge at least. And I think it's very important, like you mentioned, that even a session should not be a one off session, because I mean, just going back to that session, probably Dinesh would have clearer numbers, but we did receive like a bunch of queries in relation to contracts that coaches had signed up after that session itself. So when there is that realization that, listen, I have access to a particular resource, and this resource could help me, there's always greater awareness or greater willingness to exercise their rights in that particular instance. So, I mean, as long as we have representative bodies for, say, coaches, for players, and like for different stakeholders in the sport itself, and through the federation itself, if we could conduct educational sessions and continuous educational sessions, that would go a long way in ensuring that these stakeholders in the sport are aware of their rights and are not shortchanged at any point as well.
Now we also see the blossom of an industry where agents, and there are different agencies that are on board, right? Representing players with regards to whether it's athlete management or just doing your PR things, or an agent where he's the soul of everything, whole and soul of everything of a player that goes through. Now, interestingly, so when you mentioned the players who took to signing contracts, they would only first see if the number is big enough, like the paycheck is big enough, and that's how they went by it. With regards to where I've spoken with some of the agents, and they've mentioned that the most primary thing that they want is to get a deal signed with a boot company, a brand where that can give you the boots that they play in. So, coming to that front, do you see it as a good change where you have the agents coming on board, where probably they take a look and they kind of take care of it? Or do you also see a situation where even that can be dicey, where you literally can't leave everything up to the agents? You also need to have an understanding of things, because we have seen how players in the top league as well, like say a prime example of that is Kevin De Bruyne, right? It's something I really like to quote even to young players, of how he kind of did not invest in agents to speak for him, but instead he used the help of a technology and analysis of his own game, and analysts who came on board and represented and kind of presented how important and crucial he is for the club. So that's how he kind of sold himself, saying, I am so and so, and this is what I give, so here's what you need to, this is why I need to be paid so much. So coming back to the question of, do you see like a double-edged sword, where okay, agents are good enough because they kind of then take care of your what goes on into the paper, but is it that also a dicey scene for the player if he or she ultimately does not take a final look or check?
It's undeniable that the agents are an integral part of the ecosystem. And I mean, as much as we're talking about agents in this regard, you could say the same thing about lawyers as well. Like, a lawyer could be watching out for your interests in one case, but in another case another lawyer would not be performing the same functions in the same manner. So I think you have your good and bad apples in every case, but overall I think it's always better if the players are allowed to focus on what they do best, which is taking care of their professional career, and having someone that they trust and who they can rely upon to manage everything commercial. And another important part that comes out with a person that's managing your non sporting affairs, if I can call it, is essentially that you don't, I mean, there are a lot of things that come into play, right? Reaching out to the right sponsors or negotiating the right clauses, etc. I mean, the player at the end of the day is not superhuman. He needs someone to manage all this, which could be taken care of completely by an agent that the player trusts. And I mean, like you sign up with a lawyer, I think signing up with an agent is also a relationship that's based on trust. And there needs to be good faith that's flowing both ways. So if the agent comes to you with a deal that he or she has negotiated, then the player should ideally not be in a situation where he feels the need to go through the paperwork again and confirm before signing. I mean, it's always good to go through the paperwork before you sign, but not get into, say, renegotiating certain points or so, because if you are in a relationship with an agent, you're going to trust that the agent is going to have your best interests in mind as well.
Now, to have like two concluding thoughts, if I had to ask you, what are those key pointers that a player or a coach should keep in mind as they're reading the contract, or, something that they're getting into the side of things where they must know about a few things? If I had to ask you to pick maybe three or five that you think are, crucial aspects while getting into a contract signing, what would that be?
I think the first one's in relation to the payout. Now, while the number is a very important aspect, we need to look beyond the number in terms of, see, maybe like what is the date of a month on which you're going to get paid, and is there any discretion that is being retained by a club or a sponsor in releasing that payment. It should be as objective as possible. The second one's in relation to termination, like see what are the grounds on which a club can terminate a contract, and see what are the grounds on which the player himself can terminate a contract. Now, of course, termination is fairly regulated by the player status regulations, both at a national and international level. But it always helps to see what is in there and what essentially applies to the players. And then there are a lot of operational issues, like for instance in terms of foreign players, you want to see who has the responsibility of, say, booking tickets during a season, how many tickets are being booked during a season, or who's responsible to process a visa or a work permit, etc. And probably, yeah, so these are like the major points that you would want to look out for, because at the end of the day the contracts are fairly standard across the industry. And if you have to really watch out for yourself, the primary ones that you would have to look out for is the compensation bit and the termination bit itself.
Right. I hope the players and coaches, so the potential players and coaches who would probably, I'm assuming they would listen to the show and are taking cues about it. Now, finally, Srinivasan, you are up to a new challenge. Last month, if I'm not wrong, you kind of updated something. And if you can tell us what is this new challenge and how much are you looking forward to it?
Yes, so I mean, Off the Bench was a brilliant journey from 2019 April up to 2022 December. Effective January, we merged our practice with a larger law firm, Wadhwa Law Offices, with offices in Gurgaon and Bangalore. So I'll be based out of the Bangalore office as part of the corporate practice with focus on sports, media, entertainment, and technology sectors. So, and it's something that I'm looking forward to, and has been pretty exciting so far as well, because it's a larger platform that you get to work out of. And being back in Bangalore also opens that many more possibilities at this point of time, I guess.
Great. And finally, if those listening to this episode or to the show, and otherwise also, if they had to get in touch with you, how approachable are you and how can people get in touch with you?
I am usually very active on both LinkedIn and Twitter, so anyone can drop me a message there or an email as well, and I'd be happy to get in touch and speak. with whoever's interested.
Yeah, and also to the lovely listeners, we will make it a bit easier for you. We'll also drop in some links to Srinivasan's in our episode notes. So do check that out in case you find difficulty in reaching out to him. Now, Srinivasan, thank you so much once again for taking time out and speaking to us. I think this was, to start off, it was an enriching one, and I hope you had a good time as well. I'm sure the listeners would be wanting to take more out of this. We will probably have you in the future as well, where we can get into something like a masterclass series as well. But once again, thank you so much for doing this.
No, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. And you guys are doing amazing work in building an ecosystem around the sport as well, which I believe is very important for the sport to grow well. And yeah, if at all there is an opportunity, I'd be very happy to come back on and help with it.
Yeah, and to all the listeners, I have to mention this, that when we were thinking of the name for the show, I remember how I messaged, because I had the connect with Srinivasan already through the AIFC connection that we had. I reached out to him and asked him if this name was fine, because we already have a show called the Totally Football Show. And he was the one to say that, hey, you can go ahead, and who gave a green line to that. So do make the most of, getting in touch with Srinivasan. You can do that. And, I think all of us who are involved in any sport or in anything in general, as Srinivasan mentioned, should be updated and informed about our rights and obligations and rules of the law and of the game. So, once again, thank you, and thank you to all our lovely listeners. Continue supporting us, do listen to us, and follow us. We are available on all the audio platforms. You can tune into us to your preferred ones, whether it's Spotify, Google, or Apple Podcast. And thank you once again for showering love. You can also leave a rating and follow and tell your friends about this who are also pursuing sports law. I think this also an episode, probably an insightful one for them. Thank you once again. This was a Totally Indian Football Show, and I'm your host, Siju. Thank you.